passionate about.
Sorry, go on. Yes.
No, not at all. It's based on my doctoral dissertation, and this examined youth subcultures in Ireland from the end of the Second World War, so from 1945 right up to 2020 or to the present when I was undertaking this study during COVID. So this work, I would say, it's very much research in progress in the sense that I'm currently working on converting that original dissertation into a monograph at the moment. So on that basis, I'd really welcome any feedback or any suggestions for improvement that you guys may have. So the purpose, I suppose, of this intended or proposed book is to consider the origins, the development, and the legacies of the TED and mod subcultures in the Republic of Ireland during this era. The book seeks to contribute depth, colour, and analytical acuity, not only to the understanding of these particular subcultures, but also to much wider themes related to Irish cultural and criminal justice history, such as, for instance, the generational underpinnings of deviance or the nature of punitiveness. And I'll talk a little bit more about those broader themes during the presentation. And even the book's title, The Devil's in the Details, encapsulates this overall purpose by emphasizing that the granular details of these largely forgotten youth subcultures shed important insight into these much wider themes. And in this way, the TED and mod subcultures, they function as lenses through which Irish cultural and criminal justice history can be explored. So for the next 40 minutes or so, there's a couple of different elements of this book that I want to discuss. And first, I want to start just by providing a brief overview of the two key subcultures that underpin this work, so namely the TEDs and mods. Second, I'll outline the methodological approach taken, which comprises archival research and also oral history interviews. Third, I want to give a very, very brief summary just of the structure of the book as it's shaping up at the moment. And fourth, I want to discuss kind of three of the core themes that are addressed throughout this book. So first, kind of looking at the nature of punitiveness. Second, my argument is that we need to bring about an expanded understanding of youth within historical criminology and cultural criminology. And finally, I want to touch upon some of the more controversial themes that relate to the TED and mod subcultures, namely allegations of racism and allegations of drug taking that sometimes surround them. So just to kick things off with the TED. So who exactly were the TEDs, or the Teddy Boys, as the subculture is more widely known? Well, the etymology of this term Teddy Boy, it can actually be traced back to 1909 in reference to members of the Territorial Force in Britain. So this was a part-time volunteer force. It comprised young men aged between 17 and 35, and the Territorial Force acted as an auxiliary to the British Army. Prior to 1914, the Territorial Force was very badly trained, and the moniker Teddy Boy, which was a reference then to the contemporary monarch King Edward VII, was often employed in a very satirical or kind of joking manner to describe its members. The term kind of then disappeared from kind of public discourse and from even media discourse for a little while, but it actually resurfaced again in the 1950s in a bit of a different context. When Savile Row tailors started drawing upon Edwardian fashions for upper-class youths. However, this kind of Edwardian style of clothing, it was soon appropriated by the lumpen proletariat of South London at the time and became very strongly associated with working-class culture. This very distinctive Edwardian style, it comprised velvet lapels, string ties, long draped jackets, narrow drainpipe trousers, colourful waistcoats, and thick crepe-soled shoes, which were known as brothel creepers. Teddy Boys in Ireland emerged as early as summer 1954. It's very likely that their emergence in Ireland was facilitated due to youth immigration across the Irish Sea and seasonal labour at the time. And similar to their English counterparts, in an Irish context, the TEDs became associated with delinquency, with knife crime, and with violence. I suppose just to briefly mention the TED's association with knife crime in particular. So the 8th of January 1956 marked one of the first reported stabbing incidents associated with the Teddy Boy subculture in Ireland. So on Grafton Street in Dublin, welterweight champion boxer Harry Perry was stabbed in the neck when he tried to separate a group of the Teddy Boys who were fighting. And this crime generated outrage in the press at the time. So the Gardaí, or the Irish police force, were criticised for being too lenient with the Teds and for adopting an overly benevolent view of them. The courts were also called upon at this time to stiffen their attitude towards this type of behaviour, especially when it involved use of knives. Two of the youths involved in this particular affair, they were convicted with assault and causing bodily harm and malicious wounding, and they were sentenced to 2 years in St Conleth's Reformatory in Dangan in County Offaly by Justice Henry McCarthy in the Children's Court. And there were some other isolated instances of knife crime that did emerge with the teddy boy subculture in the 50s. So in March 1957, for instance, an 18-year-old teenager was sentenced in Limerick Circuit Court for slashing another youth in the face with a razor, so quite a vicious attack. And during the course of the proceedings, Judge Barrow Breen asked Sergeant Farron about the nature of the teddy boy subculture in Limerick, so implying that the accused was a member of this group. Moreover, in Rialto in Dublin in 1959, 3 teddy boys attacked and slashed the faces of 2 other youths with knives. One of the youths received 7 stitches in his cheek, and the other got 3 stitches in his temple. Calls emanated in the Dáil, or in the Irish Parliament, for the introduction of very harsh measures to deal with knife-carrying Teds, and in particular to ban the sale of flick knives to try and curb teddy boy violence. Almost a decade later, Section 22 of the Criminal Justice Bill 1967 would seek to prohibit any possession of a knife other than a pocket knife in public places like dance halls and cinemas, and also sought to prohibit the use or the carrying of flick knives without reasonable excuse. Teddy boys, however, weren't specifically named during the parliamentary debates this decade later, and that legislation would actually lapse then with the dissolution of the Oireachtas in May 1969. But I suppose this concern, particularly during the 50s and up to the late 50s, with knife crime and the Teds, was very much sensitised by international press coverage. So there were a lot of high-profile instances in Britain and also New Zealand of knife crime or stabbings that were carried out by teddy boys. So for instance, in July 1953, 70-year-old John Beckley was stabbed by 20-year-old Michael Davies in Clapham Common in London. Davies wore Edwardian clothing. He was a member of a teddy boy gang called the Ploughboys, and that was named after the local pub that the group frequented. Davies was sentenced to death, but the sentence was later commuted then to life imprisonment. And this high-profile case was covered quite extensively by Irish newspapers at the time, which demonstrates this really strong awareness of teddy boy violence abroad. Moreover, in October then 1955, a 21-year-old teddy boy called Albert Lawrence Black was accused of stabbing a 20-year-old called Alan Jack in Ye Old Barn Cafe in Auckland in New Zealand. This case, which was described by the Irish press as the Teddy Boy Cafe murder trial, was of particular interest to Irish newspapers because the defendant, Albert Lawrence Black, was actually originally from Sandy Row in Belfast. And Black was sentenced to death for the crime, and he was actually executed on the 5th of December 1955. So he was the second last person to be executed in New Zealand before it changed its laws on capital punishment. And this murder by stabbing, which was reminiscent of the Clapham Common murder 2 years earlier, reinforced the press tendency to associate the Teds with violence and with knife crime. And this is despite the fact that Irish Teds were often more style than substance, to use the terms of Carol Holohan and Eleanor O'Leary, some of the Irish historians who have looked into this period and into this subculture, compared to their international counterparts, and that with a few isolated exceptions, that actual instance of knife crime appeared to be relatively rare. In contrast then to the teddy boy subculture, modernist movement emerged in Britain in the late 50s. And initially it comprised mostly middle-class teenagers who embraced modern jazz and rhythm and blues music and converged in coffee bars in West London. And by the early 1960s, more working class youths became involved in the subculture, and the term modernist was shortened to mod. The mod style comprised Italian-inspired tailored suits, usually with rounded jacket fronts, 3 buttons and open cuffs, while Fred Perry polo shirts, later fishtail parkas, bowling shoes, Levi jeans provided a more casual look. So the mods' preferred mode of transport were Italian and scooters in the form of Vespas or Lambratas. It's quite difficult to actually pinpoint the precise emergence of the mods in Ireland. So the Evening Herald reported in September 1964 on a group of mods in Limerick City. Though as early as summer 1962, a beat club, which was a music venue associated with this subculture, had been set up in Killiney in Dublin. Concerns over sexual immorality, in addition to drug taking, characterised societal perceptions of this subculture in an Irish context. And I suppose just to talk a little bit more about these associations of sexual immorality, there were a number of factors that contributed to these perceptions. Similar to the TEDs, it was very much events abroad that sensitized Irish press coverage. The mod subculture, as previously mentioned, was associated with these music venues called beat clubs. And the death of the so-called beat club girl, Diane Minham, in Britain fueled anxiety surrounding promiscuity and sexual violence. On New Year's Day 1965, the body of 15-year-old Diane was found floating in a stream with signs of strangulation. She had been last seen on Christmas Eve 1964 outside a beat club in Burton-on-Trent in Staffordshire. And she was therefore referred to by the press as the Beat Club girl. Police interviews were carried out then with about 1,200 members of the club. And these interviews kind of suggested that maybe quite insalubrious characters frequented the venue, while references to Diane's possessions being found at a favourite spot for courting couples implied that promiscuous behaviour had taken place and was very much a form of victim blaming that you could see in the press at the time. Moreover, the term unclothed body was used by most Irish newspapers when describing the nature of Diane's remains. And this connoted sexual violence, which very much preempted these negative connotations that came to surround Irish beat clubs. Another, I suppose, factor that contributed to these perceptions of sexual immorality was the wearing of miniskirts by female mods. A letter to the editor of the Evening Herald from Irish Colleen in July 1966 criticised the vulgar exposure of legs by the Mini Brigade. And quote, "Have these mods any idea just how ridiculous they look in their semolina pink corduroy suits with practically non-existent skirts which barely conceal legs, if they could be called that?" The views of Irish Colleen were not uncommon, which led to a group of female mods writing to the editor of the Evening Echo in despair in January 1967. "Can't anyone leave us mini wearers alone? We are sick of being stared at in the street and people shouting, 'Buy the other half of your skirt, you are a disgrace.' Can't everyone make a New Year's resolution not to bother the mini wearers?" So the wearing of miniskirts was interpreted as an inappropriate and explicit expression of female sexuality. It's worth noting that in Britain, female mods sometimes adopted an androgynous style, though there's little evidence of this in an Irish context. In December 1956, a letter to the editor of the Evening Herald from Cecil complained that most female patrons of beat clubs are dressed like men, and I would not insult myself by dancing with them. This, however, was largely an atypical comment, and the majority of press coverage concerned the flaunting rather than the suppression of female sexuality by miniskirt wearing mods. Just a quick overview then of the methodology that has informed this research. So in terms of the methodology, the book avails of an extensive range of source material comprising both archival but also interview data. In terms of archival data, there were four main archives from which data was gathered. So the National Archives of Ireland, the Dublin Diocesan Archives, the National Library of Ireland, and also newspaper archives. So they comprise the Irish Newspaper Archives, and the Irish Times also has its separate online archives. In the National Archives of Ireland, records from 7 government departments were consulted to shed light on political and criminal justice reactions to the subcultures. So files from, say, the Taoiseach, Justice, Foreign Affairs, the Office of the Attorney General. And these accrue to about 218 folders containing a variety of official reports, letters from external stakeholders to members of cabinet, memos, notes between civil servants, white papers, cabinet minutes, and meeting minutes as well. In the Dublin Diocesan Archives, the papers of Archbishop John Charles McQuaid were consulted, given the significant role that he played in political matters pertaining to youth deviance and also to juvenile delinquency. There were 173 folders consulted altogether, and they encompassed 8 thematic categories. So youth affairs, communists, Department of Education, women's organisation and immigrants' welfare were some of those categories that the files fell under. One of the most valuable findings of this archive were agendas and reports on the Teddy Boy subculture that were put together by a group called the Vigilance Committee. And this was an interest group established by McQuaid in 1954 to keep an eye on anti-Catholic activities in Dublin. And the Teddy Boys were interpreted as falling under that remit. In the National Library of Ireland, so various periodicals like Utopia, McGill, New Spotlight, Musical Gazette and Hot Press were consulted on a chronological basis. Newspaper articles were used to gain insight predominantly into the societal reactions surrounding the Teddy Boys and mods. And the date ranges of 1954 to 63 and 1962 to 70 were particularly focused upon respectively to try and shed light on some of those earlier press reactions to the subcultures. There were also some other ancillary archives from which the data was gathered. So these included the National Folklore Collection and UCD, the UCD archive, so contains the files of a lot of political parties, and Trinity College Dublin manuscripts, Dublin City Archives and Lanús. So this diverse range of archives ensured comprehensive and detailed data was gathered on these particular subcultures. In terms of the oral history interviews that were carried out, the book draws on 31 oral history interviews, so comprising 11 TEDs and 20 mods, that were gathered between April 2019 and September 2021. Gatekeepers comprising organisers of groups such as Rock in Dublin, the Southeast Rock and Roll Club, the Belfast Rock and Roll Club and Bubbles Night, Mod Night were initially contacted, and then I used snowball sampling to try and recruit further participants. Most of the 31 interview participants were male, with 2 TEDs and 4 mods in the sample identifying as female. At the time of the interview, the hometowns of the TEDs comprised Dublin, Belfast, Enniscorthy and Derry. And although the initial focus of this project was on these subcultures in the Irish Republic, the inclusion of participants from Northern Ireland, from Belfast, from Derry, was really useful given those very strong connections between North and South music scenes and subcultural scenes, especially during the 70s and 80s during the Troubles. Similar to the TEDs, most mod participants were living in urban centres, particularly in Dublin, but greater geographical diversity was attained, as mods from Galway, Limerick, Cork, Carlow and Waterford were also interviewed. And I suppose just to give a very brief overview of the structure of the book as it currently stands. So chapter 1 kind of sets the scene and it situates the TEDs and mods within the context of teenagehood. So this very powerful capitalist construct that emerged in the 1940s. And in particular, the chapter examines the discrepancies between cultural perceptions of the teenager in 1940s Ireland, but the structural and biographical realities of young people at the time. In chapters 2, 3, and 4, the book adopts a more triangulated perspective to these subcultures by analysing them from 3 key perspectives. So pop cultural images examine how these subcultures were portrayed through sources like newspapers, plays, documentaries, and song lyrics. It particularly considers whether moral panics, namely disproportionate reactions to perceived social crises, emerge surrounding these subcultures. Policy images in chapter 3 capture the perceptions of elites and agents of control regarding these subcultures, while personalistic images capture the lived experiences of the TEDs and mods, and that chapter mostly draws on oral history interviews. Chapter 5 then widens its temporal lens to consider how subcultural identities and labels are transmitted over time, and what happens to members of so-called youth subcultures when they actually age. And finally, in chapter 6, then, the book expands its geographical lens to consider experiences and perceptions of these subcultures over the border in Northern Ireland and also in England and Wales. So just for the rest of this talk, I just want to focus then on 3 of the core themes that are threaded throughout the book. And I suppose the first one really is this kind of theme of punitiveness that threads its way through the chapters. So an element of existing moral panic literature that really remains under research is looking at the impact that moral panics have on the criminal justice system. So Stanley Cohen, in his 1972 book Folk Devils and Moral Panics, described the reaction of the criminal justice system to the mods and rockers as one which contributed to deviance amplification by escalation of the number and intensity of control agents, and also the use of remand by the courts as a form of extra-legal punishment. And in this way, Cohen depicted the criminal justice system as adopting a largely populist and punitive response during times of perceived social crises. And most kind of subsequent works have kind of just taken this as almost a taken for granted assumption and haven't really kind of delved deeper or challenged it kind of too much further. Similar to Cohen, Susan Bandays, in her study of the moral panic surrounding daycare sexual abuse in the US in the 1980s, argued that the legal system is complicit in moral panics and acts as little more than the handmaiden of institutionalized hysteria. Her findings, however, are not necessarily transferable to other jurisdictions, and this very much emphasizes the need to take historical and cultural context into consideration when assessing the variety of impacts that moral panics might have on the criminal justice system. Gurari, in her work on hit-and-run traffic offences in Israel, has also kind of looked at this intersection of moral panics in the criminal justice system. While Susan Banday's work focused mainly on the police and judiciary, Gurari examined courts and sentencing practices. So the maximum punishment for hit-and-run offences in Israel had been 9 years under a 1961 statute. But in November 2011, following this moral panic, it was raised to 14 years. And Gurari argues that this was a direct result of media demonization of drivers as murderers and court demonization of offenders as morally defective. But again, this argument fails to explain why some social crises might generate a criminal justice response which is more intensive than others. There have been a few notable works who have examined instances where the criminal justice system actually acts as a buffer against punitive trends during times of moral panic. So one example is Katz's study of a moral panic surrounding biker gangs in Canada. Punitive legislation had been passed in response to these gangs in 1997 and 2001 respectively. But in March 2008, Mackenzie Jane, a Supreme Court case, ruled the prosecution hadn't managed to show beyond a reasonable doubt that the Hells Angels bikers in Canada constituted a criminal organization. And this case serves as an instance how one aspect of the criminal justice system, namely the judiciary, can act as a buffer against the more punitive inclinations of, in this case, police and prosecutors. And likewise, in his study of Italian prosecutors, Montana outlined that the professional culture of same helps to diffuse social anxieties from permeating the criminal justice system. And these kind of studies serve as a reminder that we can't look at the criminal justice system as this monolithic entity, but rather it's internally comprised of a diversity of actors, networks, and institutions who sometimes hold contradictory views. And my work similarly argues that in an Irish context, responses to these subcultures were often pluralistic rather than punitive. And the policing of the teddy boy subculture is a particularly good illustration of this. So on a rhetorical level, the Gardaí served as a buffer against, rather than an amplifier of, hostile reactions to the Teds. In January 1956, for instance, a Garda spokesman stated that teddy boys presented no problem. As far as the Gardaí were concerned, teddy boys had not been involved in any serious crime. Too much publicity was being given to these people, which had the effect of exaggerating their importance. Similarly, in February 1957, the Garda Review, so the official monthly journal of the Garda representative body, articulated that teddy boy clothing is not in of itself indicative of an absence of lawfulness. It is for the most part no more than an expression of repressed and frustrated personalities, the result of the workless and prospectless conditions in which they are born. So here, the Garda Review was largely calling for a separation between the semiotic and between the behavioural aspects of the subculture. The magazine later went on to express a largely sympathetic, or patronizing attitude towards the teddy boys, calling for them to be understood and pitied rather than condemned, although it did acknowledge that certain elements of the subculture did engage in violence and delinquency. Journalist Liam Shine, in his survey of crime and juvenile delinquency, quoted as senior Garda officers commenting that the Teds were very often the scapegoats rather than the offenders. Moreover, according to Neary, among Garda authorities, Teds did not officially exist, which indicates a very determined effort to downplay any sense of threat surrounding the subculture. In direct contrast to the role played by the police in Clacton and Brighton during the Mods and Rockers episodes in Britain in the mid-1960s, for instance, the Gardaí diffused rather than amplified the social concern surrounding the Teds. However, we have to take into account that rhetoric did not always translate into practice. One Garda in particular, and you can see on the screen, there's a picture of him there. His name was Garda James Lugs Brannigan, particularly availed of methods of summary justice in dealing with youth deviance in general and teddy boys in particular. Brannigan had joined the Gardaí in June 1931 and was stationed in the Liberties in Dublin between 1936 and his retirement in 1973. A heavyweight boxing champion, he carried a pair of leather gloves with him, which he used to lash miscreants with in order to gain psychological advantage over his adversaries. And this earned him the accolade of being the scourge of the city's vandals. And he used similarly violent tactics to deal with the teddy boys. Author and philosopher Gabriel Duffy, who came of age in Ireland during the 1950s, described Brannigan as a one-man vigilante committee and a true exponent of the short, sharp, shock school of remedial jurisprudence. When interviewed by the Irish Independent, or the Sunday Independent in Ireland in September 1977, Brannigan gave the following advice for police when dealing with rebellious youth. Give them all the trouble that they are looking for. I know you will have some do-gooders crying out about Garda brutality, but if we are to clean up our city, we will have to take off the kid gloves. Anyone I ever clipped deserved it. Despite Brannigan's assurances, evaluations of his methods of summary justice remain mixed. One Dublin teddy boy, Kevin Connolly, described Brannigan as a friendly copper and noted approvingly that he'd fight you instead of arresting you. For others, Brannigan was a violent bully who acted with impunity. It's important, however, to situate Brannigan's methods in historical context, as the form of summary justice that he engaged in was viewed by approval by the courts and by the public at the time. Overall, while in practice Gardaí such as Brannigan reacted violently to the Teds, in rhetoric the Gardaí acted largely as a buffer against the attempted demonisation of the subculture. And this indicates that even a single pillar of the criminal justice system can engage in these pluralistic responses during times of perceived social crises. A second theme that I want to discuss that surfaces throughout the book is the need for an expanded understanding of youth. So for most participants, subcultural involvement was discontinuous. So it comprised this more concentrated involvement lasting 5 or 6 years during teenagehood, followed by a period of subcultural desistance lasting for approximately 2 decades or so. Peter, for instance, one of my interview participants, described how I stopped being a mod at the age of 20 and then didn't sort of get back into being a mod until I was about 43. So the past 10 years, I've sort of gotten back into the whole scene and going out. And there are various reasons why this desistance came about. Some participants emigrated, some got into serious relationships, got married, had children. The demands of employment or full-time employment simply meant that it wasn't feasible to kind of keep up the level of subcultural participation they had when they were teenagers. Many participants became involved in the TED and mod subcultures in their 40s and 50s and fully embraced subcultural identity as adults. William, for instance, outlined that, as Paul Weller says, I'll be a mod until I die. Likewise, Kieran professed that all the real hardcore mods are still there, are still mods. They still wear the same clothes, they still have the Levi's, the Fred Perrets, they still get their suits made, you know what I mean. And the following exchange with Helen, who became a teddy girl in the 1950s and is now aged in her 80s, demonstrates how she continues to partake of rock and roll events and still identifies as a member of the subculture. So Helen outlined that I was going to the north for a rock and roll event. I just got the train from Connolly Station in Dublin, stayed at the Clayton Hotel. They had the chains, all the gear. I wore all the leopard skins. And interviewer asked, how long so would you still call yourself a teddy girl? And Helen responded that I would, yeah, a teddy girl and a rockabilly, yeah, definitely. So this indicates the very long-lasting and the very sticky nature of subcultural identity. This interview was particularly interesting because there's not a huge amount of surviving source material on teddy girls. They've largely been written out of the narrative. And so it was very interesting to capture the perceptions of an original teddy girl back from the 1950s, and more remarkable in her 80s that she's still going strong and attending rock and roll events. But physical changes associated with aging process, like hair loss, for instance, affects subcultural identity on an aesthetic level. Miles, for instance, outlined that hair loss meant he could not express his TED identity to the same extent. Well, the quiff, I'd like it to be bigger, but I'll just have to make do with what I can. I'm losing it, but I'll hold on to it as long as I can. And participants often tone down their stylistic appearances over time. Aaron's job, for instance, he was working in the transport sector, which meant that he was in contact with members of the public on a daily basis. He recalled that when you're kind of working on the front line with the public and that sort of thing, it can be hard to be different. And so what I done was I toned down my image. Toning down one's image, however, does not imply loss of commitment. Rather, it may suggest that aging subcultural participants are simply more secure and more comfortable with their identities, and that they no longer feel the need to explicitly communicate this to an external audience. Aging subcultural participation, however, is not always viewed as in a positive light. So authors such as West regard such participation as a form of arrested development, which signals a social and political malaise in Western society. Whereas others, such as Taylor, argue that aging subcultural participants simply embrace a different form of adulthood. Aging TEDs and mods recounted how they sometimes experienced negative societal reactions because of the perception that they were acting in an immature manner, namely that they were violating age-appropriate norms. Brian outlines that by identifying as an aging mod, you'd be kind of ridiculed over it because of your age. Similarly, Derek expounded that derogatory comments such as, oh, he still thinks he's a mod at his age, often led to slight embarrassment. Journalist Maureen Coleman joked that mods who became re-involved in the subculture as adults were undergoing a mod life crisis. Sean O'Sullivan, a rockabilly interviewed for a 2008 documentary entitled Riffs and Quiffs, remarked that, well, there's an old saying that goes with being rockabilly, and it says it ain't easy being greasy. Like you're leaving yourself susceptible to finger pointing and sniggering and all this kind of crack from small-minded people who just haven't got a clue as to what we're about. And this kind of finger pointing and sniggering ostensibly stemmed from the widespread societal belief that the terms youth and subculture are intertwined. I argue in the book that regardless of whether subcultural identity is being performed by teenagers or by adults, by the young or by the young at heart, pejorative connotations and perceptions of deviance still emerge and are quite constant over time. Given the prevalence of aging subcultural participation, our understanding of youth therefore needs to be broadened beyond a chronological stage in the life course to a state of mind that can be performed by an individual, regardless of chronological age. And just as a final point before I wrap up, I want to briefly discuss particular themes that surfaced during oral history interviews in relation to the TEDs and mods that proved a little bit controversial. So, for instance, there was a perceived link between the rockabilly subculture and racism. So in my work, I defined the rockabilly subculture as a 1970s offshoots of the TED subculture, which stylistically turned more to the US than to the UK. And while drug taking was a theme that surfaced in relation to the mods, I'll just briefly outline these in turn. So the use of the US Confederate flag within the rockabilly subculture has proved quite controversial. And the association of rockabilly with the Confederate flag was cemented in 1979 when the band Matchbox performed their song Rockabilly Revel on a television show, Top of the Pops. And they had a Confederate flag flying in the background, and lead singer Graham Fenton wore a Confederate uniform. Participants such as Nathan asserted that the subculture's use of the Confederate flag was not an expression of racism, but rather we adopted the Confederate flag the same way that Cork adopted the Confederate flag, the rebels, you know what I mean. So this was a reference to Cork GAA fans who pre-2020 often flew the Confederate flag at football and hurling matches, in allusion to Cork's nickname as the Rebel County. Within the rockabilly subculture, the Confederate flag signifies the geographical origins of rockabilly music in the southern states of the US, but its association with white supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan has aligned the flag with racism. And due to concerns over political correctness, particularly during the presidency of Donald Trump between 2017 and 2021, the flag was shunned big time, especially in the rockabilly scene. Jason argued that being a rockabilly and being racist are mutually exclusive. And he said that, well, to tell you the truth, I have a Confederate flag myself, belt buckle and all that, but in no way am I a racist. No way on earth. How could I be? Music originated from the Black people. Most of our main idols are Black. How could I be a racist? In contrast, Orla, another one of my participants, claimed that, well, there have been elements of racism definitely within sort of especially the older Teddy Boy scene, but that over time it has become more and more frowned upon and less acceptable, you know. It's unlikely that the rockabilly subculture in the 1980s was oblivious to these racist connotations surrounding the Confederate flag. In Belfast at the time, for instance, a rock and roll club known as the Cool Cats Club used to hold dances at the Bailey Bar in Queen's Square. The club had this big neon sign outside the front door, a big Confederate flag, and it had the words Cool Cats Club. But Cool Cats Club was each word was spelled with a K, and so it spelled out KKK and had a big Confederate flag flying outside. So in Harry's words, you couldn't get away with that today, so you couldn't. I suppose while racism was associated with the rockabilly subculture in particular, drug taking was associated with the mods in the 1960s and as well in the 1980s. Regarding the latter era, there were mixed views among my participants as to whether drug taking could be regarded as a key element of subcultural experience. Peter, for instance, remarked that I don't remember any drugs at all. I don't even remember anybody saying that somebody else had some. Liam claims that pill popping was more common in London, whereas hash and cannabis was more likely to be used in Cork. In Carlow, Fionn outlined that pills such as roaches, which are rofentanil, or upjohns, Xanax were consumed, and recalled that mods were even doing bottles of Tipex thinners and all. In Dublin, Brian claimed that drugs such as amphetamines or speed became more prominent in the mid-1980s, more so coinciding with the emergence and the growth of the rave subculture. He recalled that some mods did get addicted to certain drugs and went on to harder drugs like heroin and all that. On occasions where drugs were used, they were used for an instrumental purpose, namely to facilitate attendance at all-night dances. Kieran recalled that speed was the drug that was most available in Dublin at the time, but we used to call it no sleep till Monday, because if you took some on Friday, you would not sleep until Monday night. Tig recounted that handfuls of caffeine tablets called Pro Plus were consumed by some mods, and local factors sometimes influenced whether drug taking was part of the subculture. In Galway, Scott maintained that all-night dance venues simply weren't there to necessitate drug taking. So he said that, well, you're not going to take speed going home at 11 o'clock at night to your parents watching the Late Late Show, so a popular Friday night television show in Ireland. Age could also act as an inhibitor of drug taking. As Derek outlined in relation to Bubbles nightclub, I was 16, I was going in the bus, coming home on the last bus, and then in school the next morning. I certainly wasn't going to be taking speed at 16 years of age. Drug taking, it seems, was largely a personal choice for mods, mediated by local and age-based factors. I'm conscious of the time, so I'll slowly just start to wrap. So I suppose just to summarize that the TEDs and mods comprise some of the earliest examples of teenage subcultures in the Irish Republic, but to date within the literature they have been largely overlooked, and most existing works either focus on them in the 50s, 60s. There's some work on the mods in the 70s and 80s during the revivalist period, which is really valued. but in particular, an exploration of aging and subcultural participation is something that remains relatively unexplored in an Irish context to date. And that's one of the claims of originality, I suppose, that this book is really proposing. The book also positions these subcultures as conduits through which Irish cultural and criminal justice history can be read. And it also very much demonstrates the value when we start to merge historical criminology with cultural criminology and the insights that accrue when we adopt this approach. So I'll wrap up there. Thank you all so much for listening, and I very much welcome any questions from the floor.
Wow. That's brilliant, Ciara. Thank you so much for that. I'm trying to figure out where to start. Guys, don't forget to write your questions in the chat or to use the hand raise function. I have noted a question of my own, taking the chair's prerogative. So it's the fact that gender, race, and class, and also age appear to be these intersecting themes. I suppose my question is, what role do they play, and how do you emphasize them in the book? What's the focus in the book?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much for that. And I could probably give a separate talk in each of those categories, because you're right that they do play quite a substantial role in the book. And I think even just to maybe focus on gender first, because I suppose gender played out within these subcultures in quite diverse ways. So I suppose the first thing to note again is that the TED mod subcultures, they were quite male dominated, especially say during the 1980s or so. And females involved in these subcultures, they're often looked at as occupying very kind of secondary roles. So they tended to be positioned as the girlfriends or the wives as members of the subculture. I suppose Oliver, one of my interview participants, he said that, well, he felt an awful lot of girls get into it because of the fashion, but they're not terribly involved because of the music, if you get me. So there's this perception maybe that teddy girls and mods that weren't a really fully fledged member of the subcultures. And again, even within mods, the term modette was used on occasions in quite a demeaning sense to allude to female mods as simply a mere appendage to mod. They often lacked a very active producer role. And so, for instance, a lot of male mods in the 70s and 80s were, say, organizing bands, they were writing fanzines, they were acting as DJs, but females didn't really seem to be as involved as much. One of the notable interviews I carried out was with Tig, one of my participants, and he went on to comment that he's told me that, oh, I don't like that expression, women one step above cattle, one step below men. He described mods as they were women who were a step above the herd, but a step below the kind of directors of what was going on. And I remember at that interview just trying to keep a poker face and keep it going. So I didn't know how to respond to that particular quote. And kind of ranking above cattle was very much maybe not a consolation prize for female mods. I suppose in terms then of even the performance of masculinity when it comes to gender was another kind of theme that's woven throughout, particularly some of the later chapters, looking at the lived experiences of the Teds and Mods. So there were quite violent clashes that took place between youth subcultures in Dublin and in Stephen's Green, Grafton Street area on Sunday afternoons. So lots of different subcultures like the skinheads, the Teds, Mods, punks, rockers, would all converge on the area. They throw punches at each other. There'd usually be a few maybe bottles or something thrown, and then the Gardaí would arrive to actually break them up. A lot of the participants I interviewed had taken part in those kind of clashes during the 80s, but a lot of them played it down as a bit of argy-bargy, or one of them described it as handbags at dawn type stuff. And really they emphasized the kind of more performative nature of the encounters. And I think really this desire maybe to highlight or to emphasize masculinity was because of some perceptions of effeminacy, particularly that often surrounded male Teds and male mods during this period. So for instance, Gavin, who was a teddy boy at the time, recalled that he would have been called gay a lot because he had the quiff and he had dyed the blonde at the front, and that was seen as being gay in 1980s Ireland.
Right.
Yeah, which was an interesting one. And male mods, a lot of them kind of had the same kind of overview as well, that they were quite obsessed with their physical appearance, and this obsession with appearance again was maybe interpreted as evidence of homosexuality. And it led, sorry.
No, no, go on, go on. Sorry.
And it just kind of led to some quite violent clashes, and particularly in Galway, for instance, that some of the male mods there actually had to undertake martial arts classes to try and protect themselves against the constant attack or muggings that were focused on them. Again, for me, that was really interesting and very enlightening in quite a disturbing kind of way, because it showed this really strong strain of homophobia that underpinned 1980s Ireland that, to be honest, I hadn't been, I probably should have been, but I hadn't really been aware of before I undertook this research. In September 1982 in Ireland, for instance, Declan Flynn, he was an Irish a gay man in Ireland. He was attacked and he was killed in Fairview Park in Dublin, and all the five men involved in that murder, well, they were given suspended sentences. So I suppose kind of researching these subcultures was very, very interesting, because it kind of forced me maybe to grapple with some of those more uncomfortable truths of the historiography of Ireland in this period as well. So sorry, I've prattled on about gender for quite a while, Esme. I know
No,
we
no,
had
that's interesting. We have a question. It's a disciplinary one from Soraya McIntosh, and she wants to know what degree you're specialized in.
That's a really good question, Sarah. So I'm a bit of a jack of all trades. My undergrad was history and politics, also incorporating sociology and economics. And then I went on to criminology at postgrad, a master's and PhD level. So I think my work still very much reflects that jack of all trades, that draws on history, on sociology, bit of policy making and stuff in there as well, and obviously on criminology then. So a little bit of everything, I think, is the answer to that.
Okay. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Soraya. Do we have any other questions? Sorry. We have Louise has raised her hand. Louise?
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Perfect.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Ciara, really interesting presentation. Thank you very much. I'm a researcher in children's rights and youth justice. I'm based in Brunel, but yeah, my background is in Ireland and Irish youth justice, as you can probably hear. So yeah, I was just interested in the extent, I suppose, to which your book is kind of reflecting on the impact on the development of policy, I suppose, criminal justice policy. But I mean, given the fact that youth justice policy was really very slow to develop in Ireland, but you know, around the time you're talking about, you have the development of the diversion program on a more informal basis. To what extent does your book, I suppose, reflect on those kinds of more formal law and policy developments?
Absolutely. That's a really, really interesting question. Thank you so much for asking that. So, I think one of the big challenges of this book was that I was trying to incorporate that kind of youth justice and perspective of it. And like you said, there's a massive literature on it, but this particular period I was looking at, there weren't maybe a huge amount of kind of developments in youth justice. So, kind of I started kind of going through a lot of the archival material, what policymakers, what civil servants, what politicians were talking about and writing out during youth justice. And I reframed that period, the 1940s and the 1970s, as comprising three different policy lenses when it came to youth justice. So I outlined that there was this kind of interplay between a moralistic lens of youth justice, and that it was a psychogenic lens and a sociological lens. So the kind of psychogenic lens was more so looking at maybe the emergence of psychiatry during that period, because it did start to emerge around the 40s and 50s, and that idea of youth deviance as a product of kind of maybe social dysfunction or some sort of aberration that could be fixed through maybe medical treatment. And it was really interesting with the mods that there was actually an intersection of this psychogenic lens and the mod subculture, because with the drug taking in particular during the 60s at the time, and particularly during the late 60s, that there was this concern obviously over mods taking drugs, that there was this kind of more so a health lens, that they were almost a risk to themselves, and there's this idea idea that these people are seriously maladjusted and need this kind of treatment. So it was really interesting to see that kind of lens intersecting with the mods. And to be honest, with the TEDs a little bit earlier on during the 1950s, it was predominantly this very moralistic approach to youth justice, and that was very, very evident from the archives and from the different responses to them. So I had mentioned, for instance, that one of the kind of interest groups or moral entrepreneurs that emerged in response to the Teddy Boys during this period was this group called the Vigilance Committee. So Archbishop John Charles McQuaid, who was very involved in the development of youth justice during the 50s, 60s, and right up to the 70s, had set up this group to try and gather intelligence actually on communist activities and anti-Catholic activities in Dublin. And somehow, like the TEDs in the Republic of Ireland, they were not politically active at the time. They were not necessarily anti-Catholic either, or certainly didn't intend to be, but were very much interpreted by such. So one member of this vigilance committee, his name was Cornelius Gallagher, and he actually infiltrated Teddy Boy dances at certain ballrooms in Dublin. And he provided this report back to the Vigilance Committee, which is still the most fascinating document I've come across in the archives related to this period. And in that document, he connotes this, it's a really interesting perspective of the Teddy Boys from the point of view of a Catholic layman. So he describes that the dancing was almost 100% jiving. There were some slow dances. He described how the position in which Teddy Boys and girls held themselves was completely indecent. Without supervision, there was a possibility of anything happening. And it was very much this idea of respectable and disrespectful conduct, and that intersection of class and delinquency that was very much evident through that kind of moralistic policy lens that I looked at, and kind of played out in other contexts as well, which was really interesting. So I hope that's answered your question, Louise, in kind of a roundabout kind of way. So yeah, that kind of reinvention of those three different lenses was how I kind of interpreted the political responses to these subcultures at the time.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ciara. I was interested a little bit in, as a follow-up to that question, about the how the element of class impacted the sort of not lack of moral panic, but the reduced or like the lesser moral panic that we typically associate with subcultural activity.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's a fascinating variable, and again, comes out strongly in the book, but there's a very kind of nuanced approach to class that I think that the data kind of shows. And I suppose when I'm thinking of class and subcultures, we kind of have to go back to subcultural theory, and particularly that Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, where class and working class culture was the very essence of what they were looking at. And what that Birmingham school argued during the 60s, or during the 70s in particular, was that youth subcultures were a form of resistance to the structural inequalities that were brought about by capitalist society, and that they kind of expressed this rebellion through their style and through their subcultural activities. So I suppose I was very much preconditioned in a way, diving into this material, that, oh, I wonder if this idea maybe of class and of rebellion that's suggested by the literature will actually be here. However, the reality was a lot more nuanced. So I suppose for a lot of participants, having a working class background when they were teenagers didn't necessarily actually translate into awareness of class positions from maybe that Marxist or even Gramscian perspective that Birmingham was talking about. So one of the mods that I interviewed, Derek, for instance, he said that when he was quite younger, that he wasn't aware when he was 15 that he was working class, that he didn't stick his head up long enough from the clothes and the records to look at the wider political situation and realize that he was maybe being disadvantaged by class structures in society. So again, it comes back to those kind of fundamental criticisms of the Birmingham school, that semiotic analysis that they use to interpret members of youth subcultures as providing resistance to capitalism, that is something that most members of youth subcultures themselves did not have an awareness of at the time as well. So I found that quite interesting. was also participants who emphasised the very cross-class reach of the TED and mod subcultures. So Orla maintained that rockabilly, so that kind of later offshoot TED subculture in the 70s and 80s, was exactly the same as any other cross-section of society. Frank also described when attending Bubbles nightclub that it had a very cross-class reach, that he outlined you have people from everywhere, from Blackrock, from Ballyfermot, from Coolock, and so from a wide variety of middle class and kind of maybe working class areas as well. So yeah, there was a degree of evidence of rebellion, I should say, among participants' account, which was quite interesting. So Orla viewed her participation as a teddy girl, as a rockabilly. She described this as a form, as expression of resistance to the ideology that society tries to instill in people, and Brian in particular as well also regarded the mod subculture, and particularly the scooters, which had a huge range of like excessive lights and mirrors and etc., as a symbol of rebellion. And he described being a mod as like giving two fingers up to society, that we're not conforming to what you tell us, we're going to do what we want to do. But their accounts weren't necessarily accounts of class rebellion. It definitely was a rebellion against social conformity, maybe against certain parental values or norms. But that evidence of rebellion against class structures, I was surprised. I didn't find much evidence of it, and it suggests that maybe class has played quite a more nuanced role within youth subcultures than maybe the existing literature, certainly the Birmingham and the Birmingham kind of side of literature has taken into account.
It's very interesting. I'm really looking forward to reading the book, because it does bring that context specific nuance that and it overcomes, like, it subverts expectations basically. I'll while the other guys are conceptualizing a question, I'll ask one more. I'm fascinated by the intersection with age. So for instance, the idea of a 43-year-old subculture participation or participant is fascinating to me.
Absolutely. And again, I'll be honest, I probably should have expected that going into this work, but I honestly didn't. Like, the original title of this work was quite different, and the cutoff point, it was 1945 to 85. So I had expected, to find TEDs and mods in their origins in the 50s and 60s. And there was a little bit of work on that revivalist period as well during the 70s and 80s. So kind of the second wave, and when maybe the next generation came along. I was not expecting to find that subcultural participation was still so vibrant, especially I was researching in Dublin at the time, which kind of blew my mind a little bit to some extent. So that theme of aging and subcultural participation has become a really big part of the book, but it developed very organically, and it wasn't something that I had preempted. It probably is something that I should have preempted. But yeah, there's a particular quote by, I think it was Billy Simpson, writing in the Belfast Telegraph about youth subcultures in 1980, 1981 Ireland. And he used this term, the Peter Pan syndrome, to describe these these subcultural participants, this idea that they're trying to cling on to this long lost notion of youth. And these people need to grow up and accept the responsibilities of adulthood. And I find that really interesting and also really problematic, because my interviews, they found that, look, these people, like some of the participants did say, I attend Bubbles Mod Night in Dublin on a Friday or Saturday night or whatever, and I feel like I'm 16 again. So some of them, there was a degree of recapturing of youth, but for others, they described how that subculture was there to support them during adulthood with the problems that adulthood brought. So serious illness and divorce, for instance, these were really vital support networks for people during this period. I was also carrying out research during COVID. So COVID kind of hit in the middle of data collection. So everything moved online, but it actually proved to be really beneficial, because it allowed me to trace, I suppose, how subcultures provided that maybe coping network for people during the pandemic, and also the adaptations that the subcultures had to take. So for instance, the Teddy Boys switched over to Twitch, which is an online streaming platform, and they kind of held their maybe record sessions or dance hops or whatever through that. Mods switched over to Facebook Live technology. So again, you'd have someone at home, the DJ, putting on the records. Everyone would dress up and they would share photos and interact with each other and through the kind of the Facebook or through the kind of posting mechanism. So that in itself was very interesting. So yeah, I wasn't expecting to find that emphasis on aging subcultural participants so much, but it was a really rewarding and finding, and one that I'm really trying to build on, I think, a lot more in the book than I did in the thesis.
Okay, it is very interesting. I think I remember the first time you presented, I think it was Eurocrim, this paper with Lindsay Black, and when that idea of age came up, I was fascinated by it. So when you talked about it just now, I thought, oh, yes, I wanted to talk some more about that. Do we have any questions from the group? Do you use these case studies in your teaching?
Moment, I'll be honest, I don't, and that's probably because I'm still kind of suppose the first year on the job. That I'm covering a lot of kind of different modules or whatever, but down the line there is definitely something on subcultures that I do want to introduce. I'm introducing one on historical criminology next year, so I'm hoping subcultures will be the next module that comes along once I have the other one done. And so for the moment, not so much, but I am hoping in time that this is going to become maybe a bigger part of my teaching, and kind of introducing that research-led teaching that Sheffield really emphasizes, and a lot of institutions here do.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to this. I know I've said it before, but I think it'll make a really interesting contribution, because it does go so far beyond what we expect to see when we talk about subcultural ideas, class ideas, and also that intersection with gender and age. And yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Guys, Ciara is open to answering any questions you have. Suggestions for writing, feedback in general. We had a few people having to leave to do some childcare duties. So Eleanor had to pick up her daughter, and so did Lizzie Seal. So yeah, they did enjoy the presentation, as they noted in the chat.
Oh, that's great.
Okay. Well, folks, thank you very much for coming and for your questions. If there are no other questions for Ciara, I'll wrap the session up at this time. And hopefully we'll see you in the next one, which is next week with Leah Cleghorn. Thanks so much. Ciara, do you want to stick around?
Perfect, will do.
I think some people might have. How do you do this thing? Where someone is still there, but they're not there? Remove.
There we go. I didn't actually know you could do that. That's handy. I'm so bad at Zoom. You think after COVID I'd know it.
I know.
How does this work?
The thing is, I think because the technology keeps evolving or upgrading, everything you know just kind of quickly fades away, like from one week to the next. It's so frustrating. Brilliant. My God. It's gonna be, because it's so, like, when you talk about context, right? When you were giving the literature from the moral panics perspective, from the different context, it makes me think about the way we, in terms of path dependence, when we do research, we reproduce what others have done rather than try to find that uniqueness that we can put forward. So I think it's going to be something really special. Like, obviously you know this already, so
no, thanks, Desiree. It's really nice. I've finished off the book proposal. I'm kind of rewriting an intro and a chapter, so it's all getting very real now and very exciting.
I'll stop the recording.